So over the last few weeks, tensions have flared between China and Japan, because to the Chinese, it's very clear that Japan, under the new Prime Minister Takaichi, is trying to provoke a battle, provoke tension with China by saying that if China were to reunify with Taiwan, that this would be a security threat to Japan, and Japan would have to move. Now, for many of my fellow Americans, they view this as China is trying to oppress Taiwan, China is trying to oppress Japan. And a large part of that is because there's been a rewriting of history. And one of the issues that I wanted to bring up to the listeners and viewers here is why China is so concerned about Japan's moves. I think first, a lot of foreigners don't realize exactly what Japan did to China and the rest of Asia during World War II. They enslaved hundreds of thousands of Chinese and South Korean women and from other nationalities and forced them to be sex slaves for the Japanese Imperial Army. They killed tens of millions of Chinese in their invasion, not just of Manchuria in the northeastern part of China, but when they came all the way down through the country. And they also, in Unit 731, launched a lot of biological human test experiments in the same way that Joseph Mengele did in Auschwitz when, as a Nazi, against Jews and Romanis and homosexuals. So a lot of people say to me, but Shaun, these were atrocities that Japan committed 80 years ago. This has nothing to do with modern Japan. This is the Chinese that are whipping up nationalism, whipping up propaganda from the Communist Party of China to try to create an us versus them attitude and to sort of get the Chinese not to be so upset about failings with the CPC and the weak economy. But here's the thing. Japan itself has not really acknowledged what happened during World War II. There have been some light apologies here and there in the 1980s from a prime minister, but many Japanese in the government do not admit exactly what happened in World War II. So the fear among Chinese, and let's be honest, fear among South Koreans, Singaporeans, Malaysians, and other countries in Asia that suffered under the Japanese Imperial Army in World War II is that could happen again. If you don't know your own history, you're bound to repeat it. Now, let me give you an example. I did my graduate studies at Harvard, and one of my classmates was really a wonderful person. I enjoyed talking with this classmate, but this classmate was sent by Japan's government to Harvard to learn about America, learn about China, and build up relations. And this classmate told me that the comfort woman, the hundreds of thousands of Chinese and South Korean women that were enslaved by the Japanese Imperial Army weren't raped, which they were, often up to 50 times a day by 50 different men, but they were happy being comfort women because these Chinese were so poor and the Japanese government gave them a few dollars a day. So it was worth it for them to do. So here's the problem. Many Japanese are rewriting history. They don't acknowledge what they did or what their ancestors did during World War II. And if you don't recognize what you did, you're bound to repeat it again. Japan is doubling their military defense budget over the next 5 years versus 10 years for China. Japan is talking with NATO about potentially opening up a NATO office in Tokyo. So for all of the nations in Asia, they're starting to get more and more nervous about an aggressive Japanese state that's rewriting history. So I used to live in the Philippines. I taught at Trinity College of Quezon City in Manila. I also worked with a tribe doing aid work in Sagada in Mountain Province. I also taught English in Bundang in South Korea, a suburb of Seoul. I studied at NTU in Singapore, and obviously I've spent most of the last 28 years of my life in China. And when I interviewed old people in their 80s, in the 1990s, when I lived in all these countries, they all said surprisingly similar stories about the atrocities committed by the Japanese Imperial Army. They talked about murders, they talked about rapes, they talked about torture and mutilation. And this is something that people in their 80s, again, from many different countries, from different races, different religions, from different political systems, all said the same thing about Japan. And it's important, I think, that America, that the world recognizes and remembers exactly what Japan did during World War II, because there's a reason why Japan was not allowed to have its own military and was only allowed to have self-defense forces. There is a reason why Germany also was not supposed to have an offensive military force. It's because these two countries unleashed devastation across the world. And again, to give credit to Germany, they've made atonement for World War II, and they recognize the atrocities that their country did 80 years ago. But the Japanese haven't. And so you see, Foreign Minister Wang Yi from China met with the Foreign Minister of Russia, Lavrov, to talk about we need to maintain and ensure the post-World War II order, where we have open trade, where we ensure that the people who unleashed tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people dying, billions suffering during World War II, don't rearm, don't become overly nationalistic, where they could cause a World War III. I think it's a reminder from Russia and China to the whole world that they need to learn from history. Because you see, it's being rewritten, not just in the United States, but also in Europe. You see Kaja Kallas, the head of foreign policy for the European Union, has rewritten how many countries have invaded Russia, how many countries Russia invaded in Europe. She's taken a very warlike, warmongering stance against China. And when you see some of the religious and ethnic hatred and what's going on in Europe right now, it just gets everybody scared. And I think that's why Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, is trying to remind everyone, the dangers of forgetting history, the dangers of letting countries that, truth be told, are historically aggressive from rearming again. I'm half Jewish. I'm very proud of being half Jewish. My family came from Germany. But I don't get scared about Germany in the same way that I get scared about Japan, because Germany, to their credit, teach in their schools exactly what the Nazis did to Jews in the 1940s. It's illegal to be a Nazi or a neo-Nazi in Germany. And they've paid reparations and they've made many apologies. So it's very clear to Jews that Germany is atoning for their ancestors' sins in the 1930s and 1940s. And that's why you look at it, Germany and Israel are extremely close right now. And actually, Germany might even be Israel's biggest supporter in the world. Japan, again, is not acknowledging the atrocities that their ancestors committed. And that's why people are scared throughout Asia. So there's a question of whether the Prime Minister of Japan has taken a truculent tone trying to provoke China from her own accord, or if she's being used as a vassal by the United States and Trump, who's trying to create maybe a proxy war with China, the way that many in China think the United States did with Ukraine against Russia. I don't really know what the story is. You have, Wei Ling, a correspondent from the Wall Street Journal, has said that, Trump pushed Japan's prime minister to take a softened stance. But then the Japanese government said that Wei Ling was incorrect. Now, she's often, spreading misinformation and disinformation about what happens at the geopolitical level. But what's clear is that Japan has 50,000 American troops on their soil. They have almost 100 military bases from the US in Japan, and they actually have their own American military police patrol Okinawa. So Japan is not a sovereign nation that can make geopolitical decisions on its own without the support of the United States. When you look at it, a lot of Japan's political leaders over the last 80 years, from Abe Shinzo, the former prime minister who was assassinated, his grandparents, one of them was a crasse war criminal during World War II, but they were supported by the United States. So since the end of World War II, a lot of Japan's politicians have gotten the support, the money, just the backing from the US. And that's why Japan is so close to the United States, While you compare that with China, or you should contrast it with China, if you look at the Standing Committee of the Politburo in China today, from Xi Jinping all the way down to the number 7 person, none of those actually studied in the United States. None of them owe their political power to American imperialism. And that's why they're not puppets of the US.